Hello everybody. This project is going to be a kind of a combination of two things. It's a panel in my webcomic, Mindfold, so definitely heavy on the illustration techniques, but also this first part is really more about a design exercise, more about concept design, even though the viewpoint that I'm taking is going to be similar to what ends up in the comic book panel. What I'm doing here is purely concept design. I'm making like 4 very rough studies about how I want the architectural vernacular of this part of the story to look. And the way I'm doing that is I've created a very simple perspective grid in SketchUp, and I've put it in 4 panels there, and that grid is really just helping me keep track of generally keeping things in perspective so that I don't have to worry about the technical perspective while I'm trying to work out my shapes. And I want to create just some different languages. What that first panel is very rectilinear with these kind of zigzag shaped columns, and then my next one is all about curves, where there's this sort of archway with this kind of big gap going up the middle, so it's much more about air and light. And the one I'm working on that I just finished over on the lower left is definitely about these very straight up ponderous columns, almost like the palace at Persepolis, where there are just these massive stone columns that create these very rectangular spaces. And then both of the ones on the right ended up being more about a curvilinear kind of language, and the ones on the left are more about 90-degree angles or very square sort of patterns. Speaking of patterns, I just want to kind of shake up my design process a bit and just add a bunch of almost arbitrary patterns and shapes into my canvas, just as a way of having something to bounce off of as a designer. So I'm just taking various decorative languages from our world and dropping them in there. You know, some are upside down, some of them are sideways, doesn't matter. I just want to have sort of like an underlying texture that I can bounce my strokes off of as I'm doing these designs. And also I've taken another photograph of like a Gothic cathedral, and I'm again just putting it in there at a very light transparency and making some different colorings just to start to play around with what kind of a family of color should characterize the mood and feel of this particular scene in the comic book. And the reason that I'm engaging on this concepting process is because comics are pretty similar to films in that you will typically have scenes that comprise many panels or pages of panels that are all taking place within the same context. So you build a set, and then you film the actors acting in that set, and regardless of how your camera turns, it's always going to be the same set until you go to a different scene. So I want to have an underlying source of what that set is going to look like. And it's not really an architectural exercise because I don't care about the floor plan of this building. I don't care about whether space is being utilized efficiently, and I don't really care about whether or not the building would even hold up if you built it. I mean, having those curved arches with a big empty channel going right up the center of the arch wouldn't actually work structurally, but it looks cool, and this is a design that's taking place on some sort of alien planet, so who knows what kind of technology they have that can make them build stuff that wouldn't work in the real world. As long as it's sort of believable, it's okay. I definitely, one task of these environments in this part of the comic book, or the environments in the entire comic book really, is to create a sense of alienness. Like, I'm always hammering home, this is not planet Earth, this is not some time in the future relative to where we are today as humans. This is some sort of alien place, and even though I'm stealing from a lot of architectural vernaculars of our world, I'm definitely trying to create something that nobody can identify as Earth-based. At this point, I pretty much decided that I want to develop the two designs that I came up with that are on the bottom of this sheet of 4, and I've taken two opposite languages. One is about curves and lightness and space, and this one, the one that I'm working on now, is very much about 90-degree angles and cubes stacked on top of each other, and heavy, and a very kind of heavy presence. Like, I want that, the one that I'm working on right now, to really feel very ponderous, like you feel the weight of those stones a lot, whereas the other ones, there's much more of a sense of light and air and airiness. And even though I had laid in that light perspective grid at the very beginning, I'm now starting to reinforce particular lines in perspective. Like there are these repeating elements throughout the design that should all line up with each other in perspective. So I'm starting to create those lines just to get a little bit more specific about my perspective. And one other decision that I've made with both of these designs, and really it's something a decision I made at the very, very beginning, is that this is a building that is made out of these columns and soaring rafters that are very repetitive. So it's like that one column that repeats over and over again to create an entire building. So even though the rest of that drawing right there is just a few little squiggles, I'm spending a lot of time building up all the decorations on that column, because what I'm going to do in this very preliminary design exercise is I'm just going to copy and paste that one column and just see what starts to happen with the rhythms of the form, like those design elements repeating over and over again, what kind of a visual rhythm starts to happen. And I say I can only do this in a very preliminary design exercise like this because perspective-wise that doesn't really work. I'm taking a pretty extreme, very dramatic perspective where if I tried, the only way to do this correctly is I would have to draw each column by hand, lay every element out in perspective so that all of those elements really line up properly. If I copy and paste like I've done here, things are going to start to get distorted really quickly and it's going to look really weird. But that doesn't matter because this is just a concept art exercise that nobody will see except for me. So if the perspective is a little bit bizarre, doesn't really matter. I'm just making sure, I'm just seeing what kind of shapes create a nice pattern if those shapes all start to line up rhythmically. And the reason why I don't care if these shapes are I don't care so much about perspective right now is because the other decision that I've made is if I have this architectural element that's going to repeat itself over and over again, the most efficient way to do that is to build a model in 3D. Like right now I have, what I've decided is each of those curving rafters is going to have an architectural figure, a statue as its base. So that same architectural figure of a sphinx is going to repeat over and over and over again. And the way that I'm going to achieve that is I'm going to build a 3D model of that figure and all those little doodads and decorations and stuff. And technically I'm not going to build it. I'm just going to take some other models and sort of squish them together into that kind of a figure in 3D, and then just render out, and then, you know, copy and paste those architectural elements, and then render it out, and then paint on the rendering in Photoshop. So I really, at this point, I've already decided that this design is the one that I want to go with. So I'm going to develop that more fully. And at this point, the only critical part of that design exercise right now is just detailing out what does that one figure look like? What does that one figure look like when I start to repeat it over and over again? And if that all starts to work nicely, I can start working on the 3D, and and I have this drawing to look at while I'm doing the 3D work, just to make sure that my model is starting to look similar to what I've decided upon in this concept layout sketch. And just as a technical note, I do my 3D work in Blender. I worked for about 20 years in 3D Studio Max, which is a lot more. 3D Studio Max has capabilities that are much more extensive than those in Blender, but I don't really do commercial 3D work anymore. The only time I use 3D is for hobby projects like this comic book, so I can't really justify spending that much money on 3D Studio Max because it's very expensive. So I've switched over to Blender, which is free, and it does 99% of what I need to do in 3D. So that's sort of where I've gone technically. But I'm finishing up the layout now. I'm going to switch over to okay, so here I am in Blender. I've built the 3D model of the elements that I had designed earlier, and now I'm just copy and pasting them and mirroring them, and I'm going to start to put all those in a gang up that describes the shape of this temple, and I've put each of those groups of elements on a separate layer within Blender. So once I've determined my camera angle, which is, this is going to be the viewport of the final rendering, I'm going to turn on one layer at a time and render it out as a PNG. So it'll be that object sitting on a transparent background, or more precisely with an alpha channel. And then I'm going to composite those in Photoshop as each element on one layer. And normally when I'm working in Photoshop, I don't like to have that many layers. I rarely work with more than about 2 or 3 layers, but because there's so much detail, and because the profiles of these statues have all of these little wiggly bits and small details, it's going to be really hard to keep track of all of that detail and paint around that stuff. So I'm going to just keep those as separate layers, and it'll make the whole process of creating atmospheric perspective and all that a lot easier. However, even though the majority of my heavy detail has already been made on these 3D models, there's a huge amount of architecture that I'm going to just create in Photoshop, and I've recreated my perspective based on the 3D rendering, and now I'm just starting to lay in how I want all of the additional architectural detailing to occur in the drawing, and that's just another layer on the very top with my blend mode set to multiply, and I'm just generally kind of indicating my forms and also how I want what kind of a presence I want. So which areas are heavily ornamented, which areas are relatively free of detail and all that stuff. And then I will start to render all that architectural stuff out in the background layer, and work from there. And also just I obviously didn't go into the whole part where I modeled that stuff in Blender, mostly because there are a lot of videos out there that give instruction in 3D modeling inside of Blender that are a whole lot better than what I can do. So I sort of skipped over that part. And the figures themselves, I didn't model them from scratch. I took a figure, sort of like a generic figure in Poser, and then a generic lion figure in Poser, and then imported them into Blender and welded them together the way I wanted to, because those sculptures are these sort of sphinx-like characters, which are like lions sitting on the ground, but instead of a head, they have a human torso. And in fact, the extraterrestrial world where this story takes place is populated by a species that actually looks exactly like that. So this temple is not supposed to be a bunch of mythological figures, but rather those are just portraits of actual people in this world. And you can see those are, I'm outlining the characters that are going to be in this comic book page, and you can see one of them is human and one of them is that sort of lion-human hybrid critter. But anyway, I'm just I'm not actually going to lay out the actual. I'm never going to make like a floor plan of this whole building because it only shows up for like 1 or 2 pages. So a lot of that architectural detail I have to just lay out by hand that way. I didn't build a 3D model of the whole building. I just built a 3D model of the recurring elements. And as you can see now, I've taken a photograph of a Gothic cathedral. Specifically, it's the cathedral in Cologne. And by the time I'm done with this, you will not see any of the Cologne Cathedral anymore because I'm just using it as a starting off point for the kind of light, color, and mood that I'm looking for in this illustration. So I'm just using the color picker to generally get a whole bunch of colors, and typically I'm using that. The brush I'm using is an 80 pixel brush that came with the default brush set that's included in Photoshop, but you're able to make very light strokes with that brush, so the brush stroke has this sort of transparent quality, and then I can just layer colors. Even though the colors started from that original photograph, as I layer them, I start to create all sorts of color combinations that didn't exist in the original photo, and I can start to just create a very complex color family just sort of by accident. And what I've done is I've taken that entire color layer and I've made a duplicate of that layer, put it at the very top of my layer stack, and set the blend mode to color. Either color or hue, I don't remember exactly, but I set that blend mode of the top layer just so that it will inform all of the coloring below it, and immediately allow me to transfer my color family onto those statues, which I rendered out as grayscale, but now the same color family that's coming from the cathedral is also being imposed onto those grayscale statues, because I want to get the entire color family expressed over the entire illustration very early on, because in my opinion, I would say, at least in my head, 90% of this illustration is already done. Like all of the decisions about which object goes where, what do the objects look like, where's my light and shadow coming from, what are my textures, what are my colors, all that stuff is already there. Like I have a clear idea of what's going on. The rest of this video is pretty much just making it all kind of understandable to the viewer, because since I'm the creator, I kind of have a clear idea of what I wanted to have show up there, and I can sort of look at that squiggle and say, oh yeah, I know that squiggle is actually a lantern made out of wood or whatever, but I'm going to have to resolve all that for the viewer now, and gradually build all of those very crude washes of color into something that's clearly resolved. And what I'm doing now, as I've said in previous videos, a lot of times it's the big flat planes that do a very good job of giving a sense of depth and space. So that big flat floor needs to have a lot of activity in it to really give a nice illusion of receding in space. So I've added a lot of long cast shadows sort of streaking across there, lots of pools of light hitting the floor, just a lot of variation of surface so that you really get a sense of rhythm and different lighting conditions as that thing is receding into space. And you can also see there's a slight reflection on the floor of that vertical doorway that's way back in the background. And the floor is not supposed to be polished. It's supposed to be a rather dull floor. However, as I've mentioned in previous videos, when a surface starts to approach the horizon, it starts to become slightly more reflective, or more specifically, when a surface starts to become more parallel to the line of sight of the viewer, it will start to become more reflective, which is technically defined as the Fresnel effect, which that's Fresnel. And there's lots of tutorials, videos, Wikipedia entries on that subject that you can research if you're interested in more of those sort of nerdy physics trivia and stuff. But suffice it to say, even though that floor is supposed to be dull stone, it starts to become a little bit more reflective as it approaches that very distant part of the drawing. And what I'm doing right now is I'm starting to integrate those figures into the rest of the architecture rather than having them just floating in space. I'm starting to add all of those ceiling and column elements into them, and I'm starting to give an indication of the forms and lights and shadows in there, and I'm really doing that just using light and color. I'm not. You can see they're really quite, like, a lot of those vaulted ceilings and stuff are really quite vaguely defined. I'm just, at this point, I'm still just creating an indication of that geometry, and I'll resolve it later. Or actually, I won't even resolve it very much, because the ceiling, as long as the general architecture is clear, I'm not going to spend a lot of time detailing out some of those areas way up in the rafters. What I'm doing right now, like I said at the beginning, I want the architecture of this part of the story to be buildings that are very intensely ornamented and very intensely decorated, with a lot of just sort of, I guess the aesthetics of this imaginary culture that I'm creating in this comic book is sort of like a fear of emptiness. They want to fill every little detail up with lots of decorations and ornamentations. So that just requires me to somehow come up with those details, and as frequently as possible, I want to try to find some other source of detail, so I don't have to draw all that stuff by hand, because that'll just take way too long. And what I've done is I've taken some photographs of Hindu artifacts that I took at the Metropolitan Museum last year, and I just slapped them in there. And I'm going to use those details of those Hindu figures pretty much straight at face value. Like if I had found those objects on the internet and then put them into my photograph, I would have spent a lot of time painting on top of them and obscuring them and essentially making those images my own rather than just taking someone else's photograph and slapping it into my drawing and then calling it my own, which is definitely a good way to get yourself in trouble. You don't want to ever take someone else's artwork and call it your own. So using other people's photographs like just as like a very preliminary starting point to develop your own textures and your own artwork, it's kind of a shady area, but generally it's okay because you're not incorporating someone else's artwork into yours. You're sort of using it as a very preliminary starting off point. But since I did take these photographs with my own camera, I own the rights, so I can use them quite straightforwardly and not have to worry about any getting into trouble with anyone else. And that is a huge time saver, which is why whenever I step out of the house, I try to bring my camera with me, preferably a camera that can shoot in RAW format, because then I can manipulate the color balance of my photos to sort of get it into a color family of an illustration that I'm working on. But even an iPhone, it's fine. I mean, you can see that those textures on those columns there you can see there's stuff going on, but nobody's going to really try to figure out exactly what all those figures are. It's just a sense of an impression of a texture. So it doesn't need to be, a super high quality studio photograph or anything like that. And actually what I'm doing there is a piece of artwork that I actually created myself. It's not a photograph at all. And I'm using that also as just a kind of rough indication of texture. And as I work on that, I'm essentially obscuring it and making it rather unspecific. In fact, even now you can barely tell what's going on. I just want an indication of some sort of texture there, because if I were to really keep all those details there, it would just become very distracting. And the reason it's sort of similar to when I was first doing the preliminary designs way back when. The reason that I'm detailing that one column out so well is because I'm going to just take those textural details and cut and paste them and put them on all of my other columns throughout the drawing. Like I was saying earlier, if I tried to make an entire figure, draw an entire figure and cut and paste it in perspective, it's going to start looking really weird because the perspective is quite extreme and you can't, and things are going to start distorting. But just taking that one area that's relatively close to the horizon and then cutting and pasting it into the other areas, it's still, technically the perspective is wrong, but it's too small and too subtle for anyone to notice. So that's definitely going to be a huge time saver for me to just sort of take those textures and repeat them. And another reason why I want to add quite a bit of detail there, and as you can see, a lot of other areas of the drawing are really quite sloppy, is because I want to start to create a visual, a hierarchy of importance within the drawing. So that one architectural element that's kind of in the middle almost is something I want the eye to draw to, so the eye has some place to go to focus on, and then the viewer can start to like drift around and look at other elements of the drawing. But I want some areas to be quite intense, like that one, and then other areas to start to just drift off into an almost kind of hazy sense of non-resolution, just because in my opinion that's part of the job of the artist, is to be the guide. Like the artist wants to tell the viewer, this is the story that I'm telling with this drawing, this is the way I want your gaze to follow through, to look at different parts of the drawing, sort of like a film director. Like I'm setting up how the viewer should experience this drawing. Sometimes I see a lot of illustrations, and like I definitely make this mistake a lot, is I put a ton of detail everywhere. Like every square inch of the illustration is filled with detail, which in my opinion is kind of lazy, because I'm not taking responsibility for creating the experience of how the viewer should experience the drawing. I'm just saying, okay, here's a bunch of information, it's up to you to make heads or tails of it. I don't want to do that. I want to have some information being very, very prominent, and other parts of the painting I'm saying, yeah, there's like a ceiling, there's some other hallways back there, but you don't need to care about them. It's just other parts of the building, but don't pay too much attention to those areas. Another part of that, I guess, choreography, really, that visual choreography is being taken on by the use of light and shadow. I guess in film that would be the director of photography's job. So right now that figure in the foreground has this huge cast shadow that's falling over it, and that does two things. One, it knocks that figure way back in importance. Two, it gives a sense that this space has like these pools of light, so it's creating a rhythm of light and shadow, rather than giving the sense that this space has an even wash of light everywhere. There's some areas that are light and some areas that are dark, and that's just going to increase the visual rhythms of the whole space. I'm doing a similar thing back here, and in general on that area to the extreme right of the drawing, I'm gonna black out a lot of that because the story is happening, like I said, on that architectural element that's near the center. There's going to be some characters walking through the space. That's part of the story. So I don't want the eye going up to the upper right at all. The whole way that I've designed those shapes on the right side of the painting is that they're making kind of a almost like a wave, like a curl. It's your eye is starting on that figure in the center, then the eye is coming down towards the floor, and then sort of like a wave cresting there's a big loop that's directing the eye back into the painting, almost like a spiral. So that's kind of the way that I've set up that composition. And again, that figure in the very left of the painting, the figure way in the foreground, that hot blast of light on its belly is kind of creating like a barrier so that the eye doesn't want to drift over there anymore. The eye is sort of keeping the eye constrained into the central third of the illustration. As I've said in previous videos, I always like to have a sense of some surfaces are very smooth gradations and other marks have very sharp borders. So I've selected areas of the ceiling, and I'm painting within that selection so that the edge of that selection area is going to be quite crisp, but within that selection area, it's a very smooth gradient. I think whenever the viewer sees some gradations that are smooth and some edges that are sharp, it gives a stronger sense of perceiving space. So if those edges up there had remained all scribbly throughout, if those edges were still very scribbly and rough by the end of the drawing, it just would have looked too hazy, and the viewer would really look up there and think like, I don't understand how this building was built. It's just too vague. So even though I don't want a lot of detail up there, I do want to give a sense of how that ceiling is constructed, which is this sort of vaulted arch with a giant trench going across the middle of it, sort of like almost like a big skylight that's giving a hot sense of light coming in from outside and illuminating this space that's actually rather dark. And one thing that's starting to happen here is, like I said at the beginning, each of those figures is on a separate layer, which helps to keep my edges crisp. But the downside is, at least for me, I guess I'm too much of a scatterbrain. I have trouble managing which layer I'm drawing on, so a lot of times I have to turn layers on and off and on and off just to figure out which layer I actually want to draw on, which is that's why I prefer to work on as few layers as possible. I just like to get in there and start scribbling and not have to worry about which layer I'm on. But in this case, it ended up being more efficient to have them separate. So there's a whole lot of noodling and cleaning up edges going on here, and also just kind of balancing light and shadow. The lighting solution is not very realistic. I'm just sort of putting lights and cast shadows wherever I think it would look interesting, but I'm not really thinking like, where is the exact light source that's producing this particular shadow. I'm just sort of going for the drama and leaving it at that, which is pretty much normal. I mean, if you look at any Hollywood movie, that's pretty much what they're going to do as well. It's not about being super accurate about how these lights are working. I'm starting to do a lot of atmospheric perspective, so I'm creating a lot of haze to really make to give a sense of this very epic scale of this hall. And that's where having all of those separate layers starts to come in handy, because I can just throw a gradation in between the layers of, you know, let's say the fifth and the sixth figure way back there, and then it'll create a nice sense of atmosphere, but all of the details of the figures will still be quite crisp. And what I'm doing now is some more universal color balance. So adding some greater cast shadow, or not cast shadows, but shaded areas. It's a layer with the blend mode set to multiply that's on top of everything else. And now I'm doing the opposite, where I'm putting another layer on top of everything else that's set to screen, and I'm just adding some shafts of light. And I'm also using a textured sort of splatter looking brush just to add a bit of arbitrary texture into the whole thing, and just give a little bit of sense of random chaotic lighting, and also just adding, I guess it's sort of a cliche at this point, just add a few sort of motes of suspended dust particles catching those rays of light to make it look even more atmospheric. And then same technique that I used earlier, I'm just adding texture to that floor by getting a photograph of stone and setting the blend mode of that layer to soft light, and then just kind of probably setting the transparency really low to again give an indication that there's stone-like stuff there, but I'm not getting very detailed about it. And this is now I would say I'm very near the end of the drawing, and I'm just doing universal corrections, like I'm doing a lot of stuff with color balance. I'm adding some bluish, purplish colors in there. And this now is the final illustration. You can see I've made the floor a much more distinctly bluish, purplish color, just to add a contrast color there. I didn't want the whole thing to be just one gigantic yellow splash. I wanted another color coming in, and I've added 3 of the characters from the comic book walking through there, just mostly to give a sense of scale. There's no real reason. The characters don't have any dialogue there, so there's no reason to really have them be a prominent part of the composition. Just wanted to add a little bit of a human element, but that's the whole process right there. And I hope you had fun watching, and maybe got a few tips in the process. And I will talk to you next time. Okay. Thanks. Bye.